When we at CSREA built this concept of the third rail, the principle was to figure out how to have a conversation about topics that were so electric that people largely avoided them. Things when I came up with that were much less polarized than they are now. I don't even know if I would come up with this now because it's already always a third rail, everything. But why this matters to me in particular is that affirmative action was actually the #1 topic in my mind when I thought of this, because it seemed so important to deal with, and yet very rarely do we have an adequate historical frame and a sense of, what's at stake and what's happened between that formation and where we are now. And frankly, there's really nobody else I want to hear on this topic than Robin D.G. Kelley. It's really, there are just some people who are just amazing in many ways, and Robin is one of them. I'm going to just very briefly mention a few of his books. If I mention them all, you would never get his talk. And I won't mention all the essays because that would also mean we'd be here till 6:30. There'd be not enough refreshments for that. But I want to just say very quickly, he's an incredibly prolific, creative and visionary scholar. He doesn't just do work, he changes the field he works in over and over. And that's a remarkable achievement in many ways. Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communist during the Great Depression, game changer. Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, game changer. Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Aboriginal. He learned piano to figure out Monk. Can you go figure? How committed can you be? And our history has always been Contraband, in defense of Black studies. Essays everywhere, always committed, and a dear friend for now going on almost 40 years. Goodness, that's insane. Robin D.G. Kelley.
Okay, I have a lot to say. I'm going to try to be brief because I want to have a conversation with Tricia afterwards and with everyone else. Before I say anything, it's also great to see a lot of friends and people I haven't seen in a long time. Big thanks to Tricia. She's absolutely right. It was 37 years ago in this city that we used to meet. And I was teaching down the street in another town and had a lot of conversations about many things, about our work, about the music, but also about this topic, And so in many ways, giving this talk here is a kind of return. Almost every really good thing I've ever learned in my life that I use over and over again, I learned from Tricia. So sometimes I quote her, sometimes I take credit for it. It doesn't matter. The other thing I want to do before I begin is just to give props to the students at Brown, especially those students for Justice Palestine, who have been really holding it down. I mean, the statement that came out of Brown has been probably the best. And I know that you've completed a hunger strike not long ago. So I'm in solidarity with you. And, I know that you've also had to deal with a lot of struggles and trauma and resistance, but just know that you're not alone. Okay, so last year, a lot of people mourned the death of affirmative action thanks to the Supreme Court's decision on Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus Harvard, and the same versus UNC. And you know how it ended. It was 6-3 ruling that the court declared that Harvard and UNC's admissions program violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, arguing that they allegedly discriminated against Asian Americans. Now, anyone who followed the case, who's been following these cases for years, know that the majority opinion is as specious as the argument that affirmative action fundamentally discriminates against white people. It ignores the role that Asian Pacific American organizations played, activists played in defending the policy of affirmative action and diversity within the APA communities. And this is a diversity of a community that's full of underrepresented so-called minorities: Hmong, Vietnamese, Filipino, Laotian, Samoan, Mongolian, Cambodian Americans, and go on and on. But the movement to eliminate affirmative action was never really interested in Asian Pacific American rights. That was the end point of a long, long death. So what is affirmative action? Generally speaking, all it really means is the use of law and policy to ensure that groups who have experienced historical and or contemporary discrimination receive fair consideration, either in hiring, promotion, admissions to schools around race, gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation. And it's meant, primarily to counter kind of old boys networks that create opportunities for white men not in those networks. And it can be compensatory as well to make up for systemic discrimination over generations. And it means to achieve, it is meant to, I should say, to achieve diversity, which is a term we're going to keep coming back to. And diversity has come to be seen until recently, and we're going to talk about that, as a public good and what the law referred to as a compelling interest. Now, currently, the language of diversity and equity and inclusion stands in, or people believe it stands in, for affirmative action, especially now that affirmative action is illegal. But they share a similar genesis, not necessarily always the same objectives. Now, usually, when you're looking for a definition of affirmative action, like if you go online, you'll get instead a capsule history. That capsule history changes depending on where you begin. So sometimes you'll find something that begins in Reconstruction with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 or 1875, or the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Most accounts, though, begin with JFK's, with Kennedy's Executive Order 10925 in 1961, which required federal contractors to, quote, take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are treated equally without regards to race, creed, color, or nationality. Sometimes you'll find that the author of those exact words is the Black, now late, Black attorney Hobart Taylor Jr., who was a friend of Lyndon Johnson. And, that comes up. Of course, Johnson's executive order is Kennedy's executive order was replaced by Johnson with his own, which required all government contractors and subcontractors take affirmative action to improve the opportunities of minorities. And this is where Johnson then includes sex as a protected category, women as a protected category. But what I want to suggest is that all these accounts of the genesis, of the genealogy of affirmative action, make it seem as though it's like the brainchild of presidents. Like someone sat around in the White House and decided, this is a good idea. But what's missing is that movements made this possible. Think about it. Freed people's demand for land, both as compensation for enslavement and an opportunity to begin on a kind of strong economic footing. That is a form of affirmative action. It's basically demanding that the government take affirmative action to provide land. Or, to put it simply, Black people are just asking what early settlers got, free land. Don't buy where you can't work campaigns in the 1930s. These were demands on employers by Black workers, despite longstanding practices of exclusion, to say, we need jobs. You can't expect us to buy products from your stores if you're not going to hire us. In other words, boycott was used as a weapon of affirmative action, demanding affirmative action. And I don't need to tell you how the civil rights movement in the streets, in the courts, at the registrar, was the source of every single post-war civil rights bill, every single executive order, going back to Roosevelt in the creation of the Fair Employment and Practices Committee. That was the threatened March on Washington that made that possible. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, all of their executive orders and all of the initiatives on behalf of anti-racism and civil rights came out of struggle, those movements that they were responding to. The demand for reparations dates back to the 19th century, but also the explicit language of compensatory or preferential treatment was in circulation among the civil rights movement, at least since the 50s and before that. So Dr. King, for example, made this reference all the time. So the goal to say that, the Kennedy administration or Hobart Taylor or Johnson is responsible actually misses a really important part of the story. And why is that important? Because if anything is going to change, we've got to remember how we got there in the first place. Not by electing Biden again, but through struggle. Okay. The other thing, just is kind of obvious, but just to remind you, even if it wasn't the formal civil rights movement, this thing that social scientists, liberal social scientists called civil unrest, what we call urban rebellions, these are some of the real sources of what becomes this robust attempt at affirmative action, whether it's coming from Johnson or the Nixon White House. And keep in mind that part of affirmative action is an attempt to quell those protests, to try to tamp them down. And this is partly why affirmative action was framed as a remedy for past discrimination and for ongoing discrimination too. But by the time such policies become institutionalized, there's a kind of liberal fiction that racial discrimination is over, and what's left then is gender discrimination and ableism. So we know, for example, that the Equal Rights Amendment failed, though there was traction on disability rights with the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, idea in 1975, and of course, ADA in 1990. All of these prohibited discrimination, but with the exception of like Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act, they were not necessarily legislation meant to actively push for opportunities. And so you can say that they're moving toward affirmative action, but sometimes are, sometimes not. Arguments that affirmative action is unfair, though, the idea that it grants minorities preferential treatment, and this is what Tricia was saying about, like, one of the third rail issues is the idea that affirmative action is reverse racism. I mean, I don't remember a time in my life when I spoke, was able to speak in full sentences when I didn't hear that story about reverse racism. So this idea that somehow so-called minorities are granted preferential treatment, that erases centuries of preferential treatment for white people. And we know Ira Katz-Nelson has written about this and how affirmative action, when affirmative action was white, but he's focusing mainly on the New Deal and post-war era. But you can go back to the origins of the nation, all the subsidies, the land grants, racial zoning laws, educational policies, military policies, wage policies, all show the advance of classes of white people to benefit from these kinds of governmental policies. Now, there are too many examples to talk about, and that's not really my focus this afternoon. But if you just look at two things, indigenous dispossession and Jim Crow, these were extractive policies, sources of arguably the biggest transfer of wealth in US history. So that the idea that affirmative action denies deserving white people opportunities simply by ensuring fair employment and access to higher education is just absurd. So if we could establish that fact, we also have to remember that there's a kind of long-standing framework that pits race against gender, and usually ends with the tagline that white women are the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. And often added to that is the complaint that racial affirmative action is the primary target of attack. Now, both of these things are true. That is to say that white women are huge beneficiaries, and that racial affirmative action, that's the only one that's illegal, by the way, is racial affirmative action. But the problem is to focus on them as discrete developments is exactly what intersectionality sought to interrogate and to challenge by showing how this framework erases Black women and women of color from any understanding of the specific harms or discriminations that they face. And then there's the argument for strictly class-based remedies. And we could talk about this in the conversation, but before I talk about it or mention it, I just have to remind all of us that the first cases of affirmative action were not admissions cases to universities, but they were cases about class, about the working class. So you have these cases brought to the courts, filed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EOC, that really challenge the kind of not glass ceiling, but, well, I guess it's glass ceiling, of hiring practices of various corporations. So for example, in 1973, the EOC successfully sued US Steel Corporation and Detroit Edison for failing to promote Black workers. But these were not cases of compensating for historic discrimination. Rather, they were addressing contemporary discrimination, ongoing discrimination, which is actually conspiring between employers and unions. Because in the case of Detroit Edison, for example, the company was fined $4 million in punitive damages for not hiring Black people, and for those Black people they have for not promoting them. And the union was also fined $250,000 for refusing to file the grievance that Black workers had put forward. Their primary complaint in the Detroit Edison case turned down, that Black workers were being turned down at a high rate. And we're not talking about unqualified or less qualified, we're talking about equally qualified Black applicants that kept Black workers at the lowest paid jobs. The judge in the case ordered the company to increase their proportion of Black employees from 8% to 30%. That was kind of setting a quota, a hiring requirement that would ultimately place more Black workers in higher paying jobs. So this would be a case of affirmative action. Now, the problem is that in many of these labor cases, set-asides were temporary, and the jobs that they were fighting for were basically disappearing due to restructuring, downsizing, neoliberal policies, and the like. So, and you could see this in the public sector, where, public sector jobs for African Americans, that was the growth area in the 1970s. And then those kind of began to disappear with the downsizing of the state, of government. Then, of course, you get the Reagan administration, Reagan's election. He promised to eliminate, affirmative action, and he fought it, at every step of the way. His administration just started gutting, for example, the EEOC. And one of the ways he was able to do it was by appointing Clarence Thomas to head the EEOC. And under his chairmanship, the EEOC abandoned affirmative action goals and timelines. It didn't enforce some of the settlements where corporations were required to pay back wages for discrimination, most notably the case of General Motors, which they ended up having to settle, I think, for about $46 million. And, for Thomas, he really didn't care about what the EEOC did, because he was already against affirmative action. We know that already. So to come back to this question of class-based affirmative action, there's a lot of critiques of strictly class-based affirmative action, and I won't go over it. And there's some people who actually support it. William Julius Wilson at one point promoted it, but changed his mind. And I'm not really interested in the debate over that, but from the left and right, this is idea that somehow if you solve it at the class level, that race will solve itself. And we know that's not true. The evidence is very, very clear about that. And in fact, Kiara Bridges wrote this really brilliant article critiquing class-based affirmative action that shows that the right support, the right-wing support is cynical, since genuine class-based affirmative action would require an actual transfer of wealth. And at the root of the discourse of class-based affirmative action is this unspoken statement about the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor. That is to say, the argument for it is that somehow it's more palatable. You can get more white people behind it. But it's based on this notion that the poor who work really hard, who are not, weighed down by individual character flaws or behaviors like, using drugs, being members of gangs, having a prison record, all these things make you undeserving, and as opposed to the respectable poor. But in the imagination of those who are anti-affirmative action, the respectable poor tend not to be Black. So that's just all kind of framing a bigger picture, but what I want to do is drill down on one thing in particular, and that is, with the time I have left, to focus on racial affirmative action, since this is the only form of affirmative action that was deemed unconstitutional, and higher education, since that's where we are, and that's, in fact, the site where it was on life support, and the Supreme Court pulled the plug. But what I'm suggesting is the Supreme Court's one of many culprits. Okay, so here's my argument. First of all, affirmative action has been under attack since its birth, especially in higher education, both as policy and as an idea rooted in what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls colorblind racism and stigmatizing myths of undeserved privilege. And second, that the struggle over including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and I would also argue Asian Pacific Americans in the academy is inseparable from the struggle to include critical knowledge by and about them, and the very structures responsible for racial and gender hierarchies and marginalization. So affirmative action was just the dying veneer, which is why they are still aggressively passing anti-DEI legislation and ramping up the criminalization of liberal multicultural education. So let's establish, whether or not affirmative action even made a difference. And by the way, the Reagan administration did a study through the Department of Labor to find out if it worked. And of course, they found out that it actually made a difference. Then they said, well, there has to be a bad study. So they sent it out for revision. And then they ended up shelving the study because Reagan's whole point was that it doesn't work. This is what we know. In 1970, there were 417,000 Black students enrolled in college. In 1982, there's 1.1 million, and this is the height of affirmative action policies. 1990s is 1.6 million African Americans in higher education. 1996, 1.5 million. Now, there was a decline in the percentage of Black enrollments after Bakke. It wasn't a big decline, like 9.4% in 1976 to 8.6% in 1986. And that's not all attributed to affirmative action either. I mean, part of it has to do with reductions in financial aid, increased poverty, the decline of urban public education. But the story of affirmative action, is told mostly through legal opposition. In other words, it's not always told by its accomplishments, like what it was able to achieve, but case by case. And I want to walk us through those cases because, what it suggests is that the war on affirmative action is the dominant, theme, always in battle. So we begin with Bakke in 1978. Alan Bakke, and most of you know the story, he was turned down twice for admission to UC Davis Medical School. In 1973, he sues when he learns from a dean that the school actually had a set-aside program. Basically, it meant 16 seats out of 100 were set aside for people of color. And so that was the basis of the argument. He didn't challenge legacies. He didn't challenge the direct admits by the dean of, say, relatives of donors and that sort of thing. He didn't challenge the other 84 white students, but the 16 who had, lower test scores than he did. The Supreme Court was split in this case, and Justice Lewis Powell issuing the split opinion, no other justice joined him, that struck down UC Davis Medical School's set-aside program as unconstitutional, arguing that this constitutes a quota. At the same time, Powell concurred that diversity is a, quote, a compelling state interest, and therefore race should be one of many different factors for admissions. And by the way, the best opinion is Thurgood Marshall's opinion, which is worth reading on Bakke. Now let's step back for a second and talk about Powell just for a minute. So in her book, To Fulfill These Rights, Political Struggle Over Affirmative Action and Open Admissions, Amaka Okechukwu links Powell's confidential memo in 1971 when he was a corporate lawyer. And he sent this memo to the chair of the Education Committee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he said conservatives basically need to declare war on ideas critical of capitalism, especially coming from the universities and coming from the media, and that they have to intervene in the courts. They have to file amicus briefs. They have to file lawsuits to make sure that the scholarship, the textbooks, the media doesn't criticize free enterprise. Okay? And in fact, we know that Florida actually recently, with HB 999, financed the creation of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom at Florida University, Florida International University. So the memo that Powell put out, as we know, was a catalyst for creating a lot of the right-wing foundations and think tanks and public interest law firms that led efforts to dismantle affirmative action. For example, the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, the Center for Individual Rights, the American Civil Rights Institute, and so forth. A lot of these organizations were funded by foundations that were responding in some ways to Powell's memo. What Bakke did, though, namely Powell's opinion on Bakke, was make diversity essentially the only legal justification for affirmative action. And that any program or policies that were race conscious had to pass what was called the strict scrutiny test and be narrowly tailored to achieve the goal of diversity without discriminating against white people. Because again, the biggest thing is you can't discriminate against white people. Strict scrutiny is based on the legal reasoning that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires that a government have a compelling interest to base any action on race. And we know that Reagan then, sweeps into office 2 years after the Bakke decision. He's backed by the very think tanks and foundations that Powell's memo helped spawn. He and his administration went to work to dismantle what was left of affirmative action. So for example, I mentioned Clarence Thomas, but the appointment of conservative federal judges put forward arguments that certain policies can have a disparate impact on racialized groups, like excluding groups from certain jobs or advancement, even if the policy makes no explicit reference to race. And under these new federal judges, that argument of disparate impact became harder to prove. In other words, plaintiffs then had to show intent, like conscious intent of discrimination, and make no explicit reference to race, and so that intent, specific reference to race rather, on the part of companies or institutions to discriminate. And in fact, Tricia shows us in meta-racism, this foreclosed the opportunity for racially subjugated groups to make claims on the state and in the courts that disparate outcomes are the result of persistent systemic racism. So in other words, put it simply, you had to prove, or it was almost impossible to prove, that there was intentional acts to discriminate, despite the fact that the outcome of those acts, of those policies, actually are discriminatory. So this, again, it's another way to cut out the protections against racism. And this was also declared, this period of Reaganism, the post-civil rights era, when America presumably achieved colorblindness, when white supremacy was discussed in the past tense, and the civil rights agenda claimed a place in the institutional machinery of American democracy. And this is also the period when, again, colorblindness, race has no explanatory value to explain or understand inequality, to explain repression, to explain violence. And by the way, this is not a new idea. You can go back to, 1873, and you could see even like the Cruikshank case where, Black people were killed in Louisiana, in Colfax. And basically, they used civil rights statutes, 14th Amendment, and the Civil Rights Act, to basically prosecute the killers. But then the Supreme Court said, you know what, states are not really covered, under the, I shouldn't say equal protection, but yeah, actually equal protection clause. But that if states allow for racism and violence, that the federal government has no jurisdiction. In any case, the assault on affirmative action occurred at the state level, legislative and otherwise. And California, of course, is a pioneer in this respect. In 1995, the UC Board of Regents approved SP1, which banned the use of race, religion, sex, color, ethnicity, and national origin as criteria for admission to the university and or educational programs. And keep in mind, this is a UC Board of Regents approved rule 1 year before Proposition 209. So Proposition 209 is approved by state voters in 1996. It's called the Civil Rights Initiative, which of course is a misnomer, but this is exactly what happens, a kind of incorporation of civil rights language by the right. Its author is the Black conservative, Ward Connerly, who argued for eliminating affirmative action in public college admissions. And the effects were immediate and devastating. So, much of what was lost in last year's decision, we'd already experienced in California, which is the left coast, they say, but I haven't seen it. Black admits to UCLA, for example, in 1998, dropped 43% from the previous year. And within a few years, the number of Black first-year students reached an all-time low of 96 students out of a class of 5,000 plus. And we saw an uptick of Asian American students. It wasn't a huge uptick, but an increase. And the percentage of white students pretty much remained the same. Beginning around 2007, 2008, UCLA had begun to increase Black enrollment by developing a holistic approach to evaluating applications. But then the school came under attack by Ward Connerly and by a law professor who's still there at UCLA, Richard Sander. And Richard Sander actually published a study arguing that Black and Latinx students should attend the second-tier state schools because they don't do well at the flagship schools. I mean, this is published. Connerly, for his part, proclaimed that the only way Black enrollments could have increased was by wrongdoing. And these are his words. Okay, this is after, and I should say, one of the ways that UCLA was able to increase enrollment was by portfolio, sort of figuring out, like, having a holistic approach. And so Ward Connerly says, quote, Black kids have either gotten extremely smart or extremely competitive in a way that they weren't 5 or 6 years ago, or there's been a deliberate, carefully orchestrated effort by a lot of admissions people to conspire to increase those numbers, or they found a proxy for race. Now, I want you to think about that. I'm surprised there's no gasp, because what he's saying is that the only way that you could have increased Black admissions is by cheating. So he's saying we got to go back and investigate. So around the passage of Prop 209, the Center for Individual Rights began seeking, disgruntled people, mainly white women, who have been denied admission to universities to challenge affirmative action. So the first case was Cheryl Hopwood versus Texas in 1996. And I'm not going to go over all these cases, but in a nutshell, the Hopwood case went to the Fifth Circuit of Appeals. It overruled Bakke. It said diversity was not a compelling interest. And the only way affirmative action could apply is if UT Austin Law School was trying to remedy its own history of racist practice. And so the case came before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you know what, we're not going to hear it because they basically agreed with it. They said, you know, go back. And so for, you know, about, this would be like five years or so, in the Fifth District, in the Fifth Circuit, those states like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi actually did eliminate affirmative action. Texas tried to get around it by implementing a 10% plan, which basically guaranteed admissions to the top 10% of high school students, high school graduates in the state of Texas, but it actually didn't succeed in making up for the losses. The two cases brought by the Center for Individual Rights, two other cases, were Gratz v. Bollinger, Grutter v. Bollinger, both 2003. And in both cases, well, in the first case, Gratz v. Bollinger, the Supreme Court actually sided with Gratz. It was an undergraduate admissions policy case, arguing that the way race was used violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution because it was not narrowly tailored. The Grutter case, however, is a little different. In that Grutter was applying for law school, and it was Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice, who wrote the majority opinion saying that in this case, there are educational benefits that flow from a diverse student body. So diversity was the key. And in the Grutter case, they decided, let's see, 5 of the justices decided that it fit the narrow terms of what constitutes strict scrutiny. And this is where Edward Bloom comes in. By the way, the Grutter case overturns Hopwood, and then now, for a moment, diversity-based affirmative action is legal. So Edward Bloom comes in, former fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He founded the Project for Unfair Representation, and that's the case that he brought eventually, which overturned affirmative action. And there are other cases, which I won't go into. He filed the case Fisher versus University of Texas. We could talk about that. But I just want to come to a kind of close here. The main thing I want to close with is that the Harvard and UNC lawsuits did the job that they'd been trying to do from before Bakke. They did the job, but the body had virtually been beaten to death. And to paraphrase Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, and I love his line, is, he says, basically they murdered, he's talked about democracy, but affirmative action, so completely that the world does not recognize its corpse. The final overturning of affirmative action was no big explosion, since it had died a slow death long ago. And in fact, we have evidence of the impact of the decline of affirmative action. And the evidence is all the mediocre white men who run universities and run government. And I have to say, how did Ron DeSantis get into Yale and Harvard Law? As dumb as he is. How did Josh Hawley get into Stanford and Yale, right? So my take is that they have taken really good slots for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who couldn't get those positions. So, we can go through the list. And yet these same people are the ones that represent the continuing war on the corpse. Specifically, the idea that diversity as a public good, the most palatable aspect of affirmative action, and the thread that kept this affirmative action alive for so long. Now, I want to say there is a legitimate critique of corporate diversity discourse. We've been participating in this for years. Many of us have contributed to it. Tricia and I both. That is diversity intended to uphold the status quo. Diversity that is, to borrow a term from Barbara Tomlinson, power blind. This is the diversity that gave us Clarence Thomas, the diversity that gave us Lloyd Austin, Linda Thomas Greenfield, the Black elite in Atlanta that's supporting Cop City right now, Nikki Haley. We can go on and on. The right has always understood this, which is why they have continuously waged a multi-pronged war on diversity in people and so-called diversity in knowledge. And these things came together, have always been together. And then again, we'll talk about this, but Tricia will tell you, we lived through both of these, both the attacks on affirmative action, those wars, and the attacks on so-called political correctness. And those attacks came from the left and the right, the call for the return of Western values, the return of Western education, the return of the Enlightenment. And we have been fighting these battles for a long time. And this is the war we're in now and have been, I think, for my entire life. It is a war on knowledge, right? Not just a war on bodies, a war on access, but a war on knowledge in the guise of a war on diversity. And it's forcing many of us who are actually critical of neoliberal diversity discourse to suddenly have to defend DEI. It's a really strange position to be in. But this is what we're doing. The question is this what we should be doing? I don't have an answer to that. We'll talk about it. And the question is that where do we go from here? What should we fight for? Do we go back, to something in the past or forward to something else? And again, if you read up on this stuff, there's so many cases or examples of attempts to get over affirmative action, find ways around it. But maybe this is not the approach. So I want to conclude not with my words, but with Du Bois, who wrote this article in 1949 called Freedom to Learn. And he says, it's relevant today, he says, what we need today is to ward off the threatened collapse, what we need today to ward off the threatened collapse of the civilization in which we live is not only opposition to war as a method of human progress, but the right to think, the right to express one's thought, the right to act in accordance with one's conclusions. Especially, we should insist upon the right to learn, upon the right to have our children learn, and upon keeping our schools uncoerced by the dominant forces of the present world. So with that, thank you. We'll have a conversation.
So Robin, this is, there's so many things to sort of follow up on, and I definitely want to leave time for everyone here to have an opportunity to participate too. But so let me ask a couple of questions about the sort of core problem beneath this shift. From my view, I've been listening to this and thinking, everything appears to be relying on the idea that discrimination among aggrieved groups and, particularly, the people in the US that have been aggrieved the most, is something that happened in the past. And it is always happening in the past.
Right.
That is to say, we're, in the 70s, it was before. In the 80s, it was before. And then, now it's like before, it was like yesterday. So how do we deal with that phenomenon, right? Where remedy is always about the past, when in fact there's ample evidence, not from the strict scrutiny terms they want us to understand, but from the, the way evidence would otherwise work, that it's going on right now. Right. So how do we combat that? Is that true in your perspective? And then if so, how do we combat that? Because if it's going on in the present, I don't understand what any of this discussion would be about.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, it sort of ends that. Yeah.
No, exactly. I mean, those who are fighting for a robust affirmative action have always made the case that it is the present. And that it's the present, especially when it comes to like hiring, admissions. These are two areas because decisions are being made, whether they use the term today of unconscious bias or whether they use examples of the kind of old boys networks and the kinds of limitations in terms of access. I mean, that's just, the evidence is overwhelming. But the problem is, I think, that affirmative action as a concept, not just as a practice, as a concept, emerges at the very moment of colorblind discourse. And colorblind discourse is based on the idea that all discrimination is past, that there's nothing in the present to talk about. And so no one wants to hear anything, and so the kind of, in fact, you write about this, is the kind of systemic racism that's not so visible. Even if you have ample evidence of it.
Right.
All you have to do is render it invisible. And so and that's why I think there's a parallel between the court's right-wing turn toward proving intent on every single case of racial discrimination.
Mhm. The burden is
The
passed
burden
on
is
the
passed,
on the
right.
defendant.
And also the insistence that all discrimination is passed.
Mhm. So why do you think this has been so successful in the social arena? I don't think it's the Supreme Court that has been shaping our consciousness. They
Right.
seem as though they're responding to their own sort of pressure points. So why do you think this has been so successful? I mean, if affirmative action is the result of struggle,
Mhm.
right, as you said in the beginning, which I think is a really important under theorized
Mhm.
phenomenon. We usually think of it as in policy terms,
Right.
as if, as you said, if a bunch of presidents sat around and came up with it. And so the question is, why has that struggle been so invisible, particularly from those who are arguing for affirmative action? And how might that help change the public perception?
Right. Well, part of it's the evidence that they bring to bear. That is the creation of a Black middle class and upper class.
Mhm.
I mean, again, this is something that we've been thinking about and talking about for a long time. The great success of the civil rights movement to certain classes
Mhm.
isn't the transformation of Black life as a whole,
Mhm.
but the sharper separation by class. That is the same period that you get this small group of middle class, upper class, striving African Americans who can move out of, urban communities, move out of the ghetto. And I'm not saying that they're not facing discrimination. They're
Right,
facing housing
right.
discrimination, all kinds of things. But that they are pointed to as the evidence. They also exercise municipal power,
Mhm.
increasing political participation.
Right.
Some of them do go to Harvard, and some of them actually do the very work. I mean, Ward Connolly didn't come from nowhere. I mean, if I start naming all the Black people who are against affirmative action, not only because somehow they feel it's an affront to them, because it's
Mhm.
that personal thing, that's
Mhm.
real.
Mhm.
Some of it has to do with an ideological shift.
Mhm.
And again, I'm not saying that we didn't have like neoconservative Black people before. I mean, we had that before, but I think they become more hegemonic in terms of who's able to get a hearing.
Mhm.
One of the most prolific authors in the late 20th and early 20th century is Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, economist, has written so many books basically making these points over and over again. It's the same book, but over and over again. And so that has been the wind behind the sails in many ways. So it doesn't appear to be simply like white supremacy in its pure and simple way. So I think that's what has a lot to do with it. And that comes back to the question of production of knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. That's another really interesting question, because one could also make the argument that the political intensity of the radical, grounded, right, socially based form of sort of critique
Right.
that drove the founding of Black studies has been displaced in many ways, right? So that you have this, conversation about, theoretical constructs, but the actual lived experiences of Black people are not necessarily nearly as prominent.
Exactly.
And so I'm wondering, how do you connect that level of sort of change and alteration to affirmative action, to the
Yes.
sense of belonging in the university? Yeah, tell me more.
Yeah, I do. And I want to just correct myself on one thing. I don't want to give the impression that desegregation somehow is responsible for the creation of the Black middle class. There's a lot of factors, and one of the factors has to do with the defeat of '68. So 1968 was a turning point, when on the one hand, the question is, and this has to do with university as well, there is a movement that says we're going to change this country and the world. we're going to end militarism, we're going to end materialism, we're going to have, gender rights, Black power, self-determination, all these things. And then the other is, no, we are going to expand militarism. We're going to get a hold of these rebellions through expanding state power and violence through the police. We're going to promote even greater free enterprise. The neoliberal ideology that had been in motion since the end of World War I can become hegemonic. And the moment to seize that, of course, is 1971. So at the beginning of the global slump, suddenly the economic crisis opens up all kinds of possibilities for a kind of neoliberal turn, which creates opportunities for a particular class of Black people, makes matters terrible for the majority, justifies the expansion of policing, and transforms the university. Because what's interesting is that 68 was a period when you have the expansion of ethnic studies, Black studies, and these were programs and departments and even colleges that had a footing in community as well as university.
Right.
If you look at the numbers, by 1971, those numbers begin to shrink.
The numbers of
both departments and faculty who are
those
involved
ethnic
in,
and racial studies.
and then they expand again. And there's a kind of ebb and flow. So, part of the defeat of 68, I think, or in the 70s, the kind of neoliberal turn affects, even those departments and programs in which they are questioning the ongoing structures of systemic racism, of patriarchy, and moving in directions that might be drawing on, insurgent forms of knowledge. The professionalization of some of those programs, where they're trying to be as fair as possible, bringing in thinkers who actually are not necessarily down with that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's uniform,
Right.
but what happens by the time we get to 1980, it's another turning point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I want to switch gears a little bit here before I get ready to open it up to the audience. And I wanted to sort of think about a tension that you raised very clearly near the end, and I want to talk about the other side of it. You focused on, the fact that, when all the jobs or all the college slots or whatever it is are basically earmarked, right, predominantly for white people, which is what ending affirmative action does. The assumption is that everybody's qualified, everybody's the best, and that whenever a person of color is being included, then the standards are necessarily dropping. So diversity is a reduction in excellence.
Right.
If I could tell you, if I had $1 for every time I heard that in a department meeting somewhere in my life, I'd love diversity, but it's just it has to be excellent. I'm like, oh, so we're going to now have excellence? Great. That's going to be terrific. I've been looking for that. So, but this association is very difficult to break, right? But there's, and so when you said, obviously DeSantis, but, George Bush himself, I mean, to get through Yale with a C is a challenge. A C average. So I guess what I'm interested in here is thinking about the other side of this problem, which is how we don't interrogate the notion of qualification. Right. Particularly when it's about discrimination. So on the one hand, you have students, like ourselves who were definitely the beneficiaries of affirmative action. I mean, we have a very similar background in a lot of ways, and we would not be sitting here. I can promise you that. I know I wouldn't have been for sure. And so, this question of being qualified, it's as if the expectation is that, I'm just going to speak about Black people, that Black people are supposed to be qualified at equal rates when they're actually provided 1/5 of the actual resources to be qualified. So there's a kind of real sickness in that, right? And on the other hand, you don't want to say, hey, it doesn't matter if you're qualified, but you have to ask yourself, isn't part of this whole process retaining, right? Resources and advantages that
Mhm.
create levels of not only recognition and unconscious bias for others, but that give advantages that are material in qualification. So how do we make this argument, right? Just from your perspective.
Oh, yeah, no,
You know what I mean?
that,
Because you don't want to get caught up saying, we don't care if anybody's
right.
qualified.
Right. No, that is the fundamental question. So when we talk about things like educational reparations,
Mhm.
it's not just about slots. It's about actually financing high schools and junior high schools and providing an education that's more than adequate.
Right.
And, the circumstances in which, even when we came out of school, public schools,
Mhm.
I went to public schools, and early on, the conditions were kind of horrific.
Mhm.
And yet people survived that, and that's supposed to be a badge of honor,
Right, exactly.
So it's a lack of resources. George Lipsitz has this great book coming out, The Danger Zone is Everywhere,
Mhm.
which is about housing and health.
Health. Mhm.
And as you know, and part of what his work, and of course, meta racism does this as well, makes the point that you cannot explain where people are in the spectrum of things, their access to things, even the lack of resources that could be turned into an outcome,
Mhm.
like
Right.
monetized, as they say, without actually seeing how the whole system works.
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah.
I think we can't, I don't say we, but there's been a tendency to say, what we'll do is we'll just keep opening up these slots and hope for the best.
Right, right. It's a very
You know?
short-term concept, yeah. Because the idea is that somehow it'll just go away
Right.
if we just get enough of people in here. Right.
Exactly. So I think that's true. We have a lot of work to do, and reparations is, and that's why I think I didn't get to this point in the talk, but reparations discourse in some ways is the way to replace affirmative action, because ultimately that's what it always was, a form of repair, a form of like actually transferring resources, enormous amounts of resources to transform life possibilities, right?
But doesn't reparations conjure the past even more so? I mean,
Well-
my fear is that, people barely want to contemplate reparations for slavery. And they're not going to ask about no reparations for 1968.
Yeah, but
So like,
yeah, I guess I'm thinking
what's that
about
gonna
it
be
in
about?
terms of not reparations for the past, but reparations for everything
Mhm.
up to this very moment.
Reparations for the future.
For the
is it,
future.
Yeah.
And so the idea of reparations, I mean, this is in Freedom Dreams, I was saying it.
Mhm.
It's not, you can't stop at slavery. You can't stop at Jim Crow. You can't stop at housing policies. And whether we call it reparations, whether we call it massive redistribution of wealth, which is ultimately what we're
Right,
talking about.
institutional.
Yeah, and because I have a lot of issues with the way that reparations talked about today, especially the whole ADOS thing,
Mhm.
but to come back to this transfer of wealth,
Mhm.
that's what people need, resources. And conditions need to be transformed. What have we seen in a city like Chicago, for example? All they've been doing is closing high schools,
Mhm.
left and right. And this is under liberal administrations, right? So there's that. On the other hand, I think there's another side, and that is we also need to rethink education itself.
Right.
It's one thing to think about qualification. It's another thing to think about what are we actually doing and learning. What is knowledge, and what are the resources
Right.
that people who may not have the same formal education actually have for us?
Mhm.
And I don't want to romanticize it, but I'm saying that there's a lot of
Yeah.
ways to think about what we know, what we need to know,
Mhm.
what we've learned. And much of, I think, modern higher education, I know with my students, I spend more time trying to unlearn things,
Mhm. Yeah.
trying to reverse things.
Yeah, they've taken root for real.
Right.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing to the wealth issue, because obviously my book is very systemic. It's not really dealing with the sort of the emotional and spiritual realm, but what the evidence when you look at case studies, shows is that people are being destroyed at a not just a biological level, but a psychological and emotional, spiritual level. And I would really, so we do want material transfer, but we have to figure out, how do you build, right, a person who can make of something this reparation, right? And that's not going to be more money, right?
Right.
And that's, I mean that from a,
Right.
an entirely left perspective, but, I think, how do we calculate that? And that sort of the effort of the dehumanization, that not just wealth transfer, but the
Right.
incredible violence, as we were discussing about the Chicago police a few minutes ago,
Exactly.
is not just about physical violence. It's about, domination. It's about brutality. It's about people losing their sense of self, which is a miracle that they have and all, we have and all.
Right.
So, I mean,
right.
I guess I just want to remind us to think about, how do you come to terms with that? That has to be more than just
Yeah.
resources in the abstract.
Exactly. And I also want to be clear that when I think about resources, I'm not thinking about individual payments. That's not how I think about reparations
Yeah,
at all. In fact, I mean, reparations in terms of like, what do you do when you transfer wealth? Because we got billionaires. What do you do when you have enough money to eliminate the police and replace the police with forms of public safety that are actually community-oriented, accountable, that are not armed? There's all kinds of things we could do differently. How do you provide actual health care, both physical and mental health care, in places where we once had public hospitals which were always iffy?
right.
I mean, that's part of that's part of that transfer investment of that wealth.
Yeah.
Not to be wealthy, but to be able to provide people
Right.
to be healthy,
Right,
basically.
yeah.
In
Yeah,
a
New York
sense.
City in the late 60s, early 70s phased out psychiatrists and psychologists in the schools. I was like, what, we had mental health therapy in schools? I mean, that's how bad it is. Like, I didn't even know,
Right,
that it was ever
right.
there. Yeah.
No, it's true. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
And and the fact that, and to just come back to affirmative action, I didn't talk about this at all, but the fact that affirmative action has been one of those things that we have been having to address as a kind of I don't want to say trauma, but certainly as a kind of psychological albatross.
Yeah.
That somehow you're supposed to question yourself because of the kind of really bourgeois, individualist discourse, which is based on the myth of rugged individualism, as opposed to just settler colonialism and dispossession. And that myth then makes it hard for people to say, you know what, I am proud of the fact that I got through affirmative action,
Right.
because that's
Right.
old. That's the least they could do.
Yeah, right.
You
Right.
know?
Right.
And then, we end up doing better work than those people who just had money.
Right. But, I think part of the difficulty there is that, people want to work hard and be recognized fairly. So a lot of people feel that affirmative action renders that impossible. You have to have a pretty solid critique to not get caught up in that. I remember, when I went to public school until I got into a private school, because
Right.
my New York City schools weren't going to really do their job. That was not going to change. And, when I got into an Ivy League school, a school full of, 500, my high school, 500 white people, 4 people of
Right,
color or something.
right.
I'm like, well, of course you got into Yale. And I'm like, I'm sitting here in a sea of white people. Like, I think a lot of people in here went to, are coming to Yale. But, it was just so, and of course you just can never prove them wrong, because
Right.
it's always about the invisibility of whiteness, right? And how it functions
Yeah.
institutionally. So, I mean, I don't really see how any of that's going to change. You can call it whatever you want, diversity, which, drives me bananas, because it really does deny the historical importance. Right. Diversity is another project, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
And I'm fine for it, but don't confuse it.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, but anyway, my point is that until we really get that, until there's a fundamental acknowledgement, that's where I started, that there's a system that is still functioning to produce the kinds of outcomes that every system we had before produced. Until we're really going to confront that, we can call it whatever the heck we
Right.
want. We're going to end up right here.
Right.
one way or another.